Boa tarde a todos. Meu nome é Isabel Ross, eu sou aluna de MBA do MIT. Bem-vindo ao MIT. O próximo painel trará o debate sobre soluções para o gargalo do setor de infraestrutura do nosso país. E eu tenho a honra de convidar para o palco agora o nosso moderador, o senhor Roberto Zitelmann. O Roberto é engenheiro industrial, ele também tem um MBA pela Harvard Business School. Depois do seu MBA aqui em Harvard, ele se juntou à McKinsey, onde trabalhou em muitos projetos de infraestrutura. Nos últimos anos, ele se especializou e implementou muitos projetos na área de portos e logística. Atualmente, ele é CEO da Intermarítima e board member também dos portos de Iratu e Salvador. Roberto, por favor.
Good afternoon to all of you. It's a great honor to be here. Thanks a lot, Isabel, for the invitation and for your words. When I received Isabel's email about the panelists, the speakers, two things struck me. First, the breadth and distinctiveness of each of one of you. And second, the financial experience in PPP of the panelists. So since I'm always on the other side of the table trying to raise capital, I think I'll leave here with one or two ideas on how to do it better. So, our first speaker is Mr. Richard Cabello. He has been working in IFC since 2007. He's the Latin America and Caribbean head of advisory service in public and private partnership. And he led a team that developed public-private partnership projects in road, health, education, irrigation, airlines, airports, and telecom. Please, Mr. Join us. Our second speaker, Mr. Mauricio Portugal Ribeiro. He's a lawyer, have an LLM at Harvard, and he's specialized in modeling infrastructure projects and regulatory aspects in financial balance of concessions and public-private partnerships contracts. He was part of the first concession of metropolitan lighting system, the first PPP in health sector, and the first PPP in the education sector in the country. Please, Mr. Mauricio. Our third speaker, Mr. Renato Mazzola, is from BTG Pactual. He holds the position of Associate Partner, Head of Infrastructure Division of BTG Pactual. He's responsible for BTG Private Equity Infrastructure Funds and serves as Infrastructure Investment Officer at Inter-American Development Bank for 5 years. Well, I will structure the panel in 3 parts. So the first part, I will give each of the speakers 10 minutes for their first considerations. Then in the second part, I will do some follow-up questions. And I will reserve like 10 to 15 minutes in the end to open the discussion for the audience, okay? So let's start with Mr. Renato Mazzola. Presentation. Just a minute, please. Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. So it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much, Isabel, and thank you very much, you guys, for the invitation. I think the idea is to go through, in a short period of time, a few ideas, a few views that I have with regards to how we can make infrastructure better in Brazil, and why I think it's an important opportunity now to pay attention to the sector. Can we just skip one slide, please? Yes? Okay, perfect. So I'm going to briefly talk about some of the challenges and the opportunity. I think for the last few years we've been seeing a lot of political noise. I'm not going to get into discussions on political implications, but I just want to say that any political noise, it's a major issue for a long-term investor. So not having political noise, it's a big help for those who want to invest into the sector. Macro aspect, obviously, when you have high inflation, when you have concerns with the effects, if you are a long-term investor, this is a major implication as well, and you obviously look for other places to put money to work. For a number of years, we had a concession model that faced on lower interest rate, lower expected rate of returns. This pushed away a lot of the potential private players to the sector. So we end up having a number of big construction companies playing a major role, mostly because they were looking for returns not only on the concession business, but also on the construction business. So there was a highly concentrated number of bidders, and this was difficult for people like us, fund investors who want to be a participant in the sector. And also we saw a number of infrastructure funds globally being raised. You see GIP with over $15 billion, you see KKR, Carlyle, a number of other large funds. And when you have such a large number of funds raising capital at the same time, obviously together with already the low interest rate environment that we face, this pushed down even further the returns. What we see as an opportunity now in Brazil, it's obviously on the political front. We expect to see less political noise. I'm not saying that we're going to have no political noise, but at least less political noise. On the macro aspect, we start to see some improvements on the effects, on the inflation and interest rate. And so this is obviously a positive aspect for those who want to invest into the sector. Concession model it's paying more attention to what private players, not only big construction companies, is seeking for. So we start having a number of other participants, and I think the last round of concessions in the airport program, you saw a number of international players. In the transmission line concession auction that took place in October, you saw a large number of different players bidding for the assets. So I think this is all positive news for those who want to look at the sector. And I think we still have a macro scenario internationally that helps Brazil to the extent that once you see where you can put your money, you see very low yield globally, and you still see high interest rate in Brazil, even though it's coming down. When we see why I also think that it's a good timing to put money to work and to see opportunities in the sector in Brazil, I would highlight one thing that we saw very much in Europe when we put money to work in Europe back in 2012. We saw that for players who were facing difficulties, they were highly leveraged, and banks also had a highly leveraged balance sheet. So this is it's an interesting situation because I separate this in two parts. The first part, when banks are highly banks have a lot of leverage, a lot of loans, and infrastructure companies, they also have a lot of loans. I would say that and especially under a contraction as we saw in Europe, I would say that banks, they had more of a problem than the big construction companies, mainly because European banks, like Latin American banks, they take a while to write off their bad loans. And this gives a lot of bargaining power for the big construction companies to go after banks and try to renegotiate their loans. So banks, in the first part of the cycle, they cannot mark down their books, and so they rather negotiate, they rather give waivers and covenants, and this actually allow players to continue to keep on going with their bad assets. Then when we go to the second part of the cycle, you see that banks slowly start marking down their books, and slowly they became stronger and with a higher bargaining power to go after these companies and say, listen, now is your time to actually find a way to sell your assets and pay my loan. And this is what I call the second part of the investment cycle. We saw this happening in Brazil, same event that we saw in Europe. We saw the same event in Brazil. companies in infrastructure increasing leverage when the economy was performing better, to the point that you can see net debt to EBITDA increasing from 2.3 to 3.4 from 2013 to 2015. And you can see that banks were not making enough provision for bad loans. Once you start seeing banks increasing their provisions, marking down their books, you start seeing the companies, they are obliged to enter into a situation where they lose their bargaining power, and investors like us, we have more of an opportunity to buy assets at a lower price, which is something that in the first part of the investment cycle, they don't have to sell their assets because they're still capable of renegotiating their terms with the banks. So I think now we got to a very interesting moment to put money to work because we are already in the second part of the investment cycle. We see very interesting opportunities on the macro front. For instance, when you see what the last round of concessions were providing to investors in terms of returns. For instance, on the transmission line, we're seeing returns of about 13% real terms when you compare to the Brazilian NTN-B bond that is trading with a yield of 6%. You can imagine how big of a compression you can take advantage of, especially when you have a very long duration. So which means what? Means that we're getting to a more stable macro scenario, at least a better macro scenario than we faced over the last few years. We are seeing better conditions for private participants to play a major role in the new concessions that are coming up. And slowly, once interest rate continues to decrease, we're gonna start seeing new ways to finance infrastructure projects. So what's the solution? So one, obviously, infrastructure is not infrastructure unless you're able to have long-term financing. For a number of years, BNDES was the main, in some cases, the sole source of financing for infrastructure. Last year was the first time the capital markets actually surpassed BNDES, which is obviously a positive sign. And we believe that we should continue to see this trend. And especially we expect commercial banks in Brazil to be able to work more on a project finance basis, a real project finance basis, which is the most basic source of financing for infrastructure, which means the project is financed on a project-by-project basis rather than on a corporate finance basis, which alleviates the balance sheet of the companies, and banks are able to assess the risk based on the sole project, as we see in Europe and in the US. Regulatory framework, obviously, we need to have more stability, more clarity. Arbitration clause is crucial for infrastructure, especially given the long tenure of the contracts and given how complex all these projects are. You always have to have, in one moment or another, discussions with the partners. So having a stronger regulatory framework, it's crucial. As I said, macro scenario is trending up, so which is a positive moment for the investment. And I think one last comment that I would say, we need to also work on having better environmental regulatory framework, which is a major constraint for infrastructure projects, especially when you depend on permits, authorizations to start your construction. And if it's not crystal clear, or at least clear to a certain extent, how quick and how difficult it's going to be for you to assess the permits and authorization, this could delay and impact significantly the return of the project. So this was my 11-minute talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Renato. While we put Mr. Richard's presentation from IFC, I have a follow-up question on your presentation. What do you think, how do you think the infrastructure debenture can have a bigger role financing this kind of projects in Brazil? Because since the creation of the law, it didn't really ramp up. So I'd like to listen to you on that.
No, I think there was some, for instance, BNDES in the past tried to offer some sort of match financing, if investors were willing to take on infrastructure debenture. I think we have to try to foment capital markets rather than commercial bank loans and rather than even BNDES. I think to a certain extent, some long-term funds, which is something that we see in Colombia, we see in Uruguay, we see in other countries, we don't see in Brazil yet. So long-term funds on the debt side, and they could be taking a lot of these infrastructure debentures. So it's a market that is still not there and could be copy basically what Colombia has done. I think there could be incentives even on the concession agreement that if you're willing to get infrastructure debenture, there will be some sort of tax incentive. So I think there are a few incentives, and I think the main reason why we have not seen more, it's because while the interest rate is so high in Brazil, it's hard for anyone to be willing to give up a government bond for a credit risk. So I think given that now interest rate is coming down, I think we expect to see this change. And in fact, when you see all the last private equities that were able to raise money in Brazil, the bulk of the private equities, I'm in charge of both infra and private equity for BTG. We raised our funds when interest rate was extremely low. I think all the other GPs, most of the other GPs were only able to raise private equity only when Brazil had a low interest rate. When Brazil pushed up interest rate, nobody was able to raise private equity for the same reason.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you again for the invitation to share with you our experiences in doing PPPs in the region. When Isabel called me to come here, she said that the theme is to close the infrastructure gap, and she gave me 10 minutes. So, so I said, okay, let's give it a try. And instead of recommending things to countries, what I normally do is to share what others are doing, just to think about how to apply different schemes in their own country and environments. So I decided to share 3 experiences that we have to think about. So I would like to leave you only with 3 ideas. The first is, let's do programs, no projects. Just to give you a context, our division advises governments as transaction advisors, kind of investment banks, but with a heart. So, so instead of doing project by project, we decided to tap into programs. And this is one of the concepts, and I will share a story with you. The second is, let's be prepared, because there's an international competition. Everybody's chasing the same sponsors and the same money. So you better prepare your project well to face this intense competition. And now that Brazil needs to bring more international players, then this should be high in the agenda. And third, even though we are focused on the structuring, we have to think about the financing. You can have the best project in the world, but if there's no financing, which probably provides between 70 to 80% of the money, then you don't have a project. So first, let's talk about programs. And this is what Colombia is doing. So Colombia came to us and said, well, we know that you guys structure project by project, but what if we would like to do 40 projects in the next 3 years, comprising around 25 billion? Can you help? And the way they decided to tackle the problem is, let's solve the problem of one sector. And this was the idea. So we said, well, normally a team of 3, which is our business, can deliver between 2 and 3 projects at the same time. Can we do 40? Can we help them in solving this problem? So we decided to take the challenge as the 10 minutes challenge she presented to me. And the only way to do this is to think outside the box and change the way we deliver. So we said the only way to handle this is to subcontract. And we changed our typical role of a transaction advisor to an advisor of advisors. So Annie is the PPP unit that was entrusted with this challenge. IFC work as an advisor of advisors, and they subcontract several transactions advisors to take care of the projects. And our role was the only way to handle this thing is to try to standardize and reduce transaction costs. Therefore, our role was let's standardize as much as possible processes, contracts, so bidding rules and contracts. Let's supervise the transaction advisors to have a coherent program, and let's do some capacity building. So those were basically our roles. And these are the results. After 3 years of preparing the program, they start launching the projects by groups. So the first group was 9 projects, second group, another 9. The third group was about to be around 10 projects, but they ran out of money. And in this transaction, we have availability payments coming from the central government as well as traffic. So they ran out of money. And then there were unsolicited proposals that were also presented during this time, called PMIs in Brazil. So at the end, all these were bid out, and you have 32 projects already awarded for about $18 billion. Project preparation. Here the example is Sao Paulo. So Sao Paulo come to us in the middle of a crisis and said, well, fiscal space is an issue now, and we need to not only to concession roads, but also to take some money out of them, kind of selling concessions because we need the money. Can you help? And this is in the middle of the crisis. So the local construction company is in trouble. The only chance is let's go out there and find international investors. Not only these international investors have to be ready to pay money up front to get the transactions instead of the typical scheme, which is invest and get the transaction for 20, 30 years. The good thing is that they're very good projects, all of them brownfield, strong traffic, proven traffic, so very, very interesting project per se. So first thing, they said, all is ready. We have the traffic analysis. We have the CapEx estimates operating. Everything is ready. We just need you to come and help us in finding investors. We said international markets require much more work regarding the studies. So in addition to what they have, we said, it's nice to have your traffic projections, but if we go to international markets, investors will say, who did it? We will respond, these are in-house calculations. They said, I don't believe it. Therefore, we have to increase the credibility of the study. So we hired Steer Davis, international firm, expert in traffic studies. So they review the calculations and issue reports saying that the methodology of traffic accounting is correct, and they did all the analysis. We did the same thing with the engineering studies and hired an international firm to review the contract and make it more international bankable. IFC review all the financial models and all that and increase the credibility of all the studies. That was the first step. Then we have to make the bidding rules more up to international standards. One of the key issues was in Brazil, people were used to give only 60 days from the time that you call that you launch the bidding rules until you receive bids. In 60 days, international firms cannot bid. So if you don't change that, there's not going to be takers. So we convinced the government to change that to 110 days to give more time for due diligence. We did the international roadshow in the old-fashioned. I know that technology now helps a lot, but I'm too old for that. So we came back to the traditional roadshows and visit companies outside in their home offices. Even the governor of Sao Paulo participated in the selling of the project internationally. So there was a strong commitment from the government to bring new investors. We modified the rules for having international firms and facilitate the process because it was too cumbersome. And on the transaction side, the only thing that I would like to highlight is the forest risk mitigation feature that we included. That was a big discussion. In most of the countries, they don't want to do this, but if you want, again, to bring international players, especially financial, then you have to give some mitigant because the market is not providing this kind of facilities. What else? Well, we also impose a cash waterfall in the contract, basically to take care of this sometimes conflicting position of construction companies as shareholders. You have to have more transparency in the vehicles that are created to handle the concessions, and therefore we included a mandatory cash waterfall. I don't give you here the results because this is an ongoing. We just bid out the first road, and it was awarded to an international firm from the US. It's the first time that a project like this is assigned to a financial firm instead of a construction company. So in terms of attracting not only new players, but also different kind of players, it's been successful so far. The last thing, sorry, 1 minute. You told me that I have 10%. Okay. 1 more minute. This is what we would like to have in terms of financing. So this is how the first group of projects in Colombia are being financed. These are results from financial closing. And you will see participation of different sources of financing. You have institutional investors in direct bond issues, one of the things that was mentioned, or through debt funds. You have local banks providing a local currency long-term. You have international firms, international banks providing hard currency long-term debt. And you have FDN, which is the equivalent of BNDES, but rather small. And their role is not direct lending. Their role is to facilitate financing. So in terms of bonds, like the question before, these bonds were possible because FDN provided a liquidity facility. And for the first time, pension funds are taking construction risk. So this is the picture that you would like to have in terms of financing, different sources, including capital markets. Therefore, the issues for us in terms of program, this is the last 10 seconds, is to have standard bankable contracts. So if the source of everything is the contract, then it has to be a solid contract, able to raise any kind of financing. If you don't have that, don't invent other things, because the root, the asset is the contract in this case. Long-term financing is critical, especially in local currency, and has to be project finance. I mean, if you go after international firms, the first thing that you will hear is, if the project is not project finance, don't call me. It's as basic as that. So I will leave you with those thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Before asking for Mauricio to come here, I have a follow-up question on your presentation. One of the biggest risks in Brazil for infrastructure projects are cost overruns and delays caused by environmental licenses that can be quite complex in Brazil. So how IFC mitigate that risk? And do you have any perspective or suggestions on how this process should be improved by the Brazilian government?
Okay, first, we don't mitigate anything because we are advisors. So what we look is for clear rules in the contract on how to assign these risks. And the discussion in Colombia took us to the regulation, even outside the contract. No? If the regulation is not very clear, it doesn't matter what you put in the contract. and it doesn't matter who the risk is assigned to, because they will have the problems in any event. So one of the key issues in Colombia is that they were able to issue a new law that includes a better management of all the risks. And in Colombia, that risk is transferred to the concessionaire, but with clear guidelines in the contract of what happens if, for example, if you comply with all the regulation as a private concessionaire, but you're stuck. There has to be a way out somehow, and that's in the contract.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for the invitation. I would like to talk about the institutional framework for private participation in infrastructure in Brazil. We all know that Brazil has a huge gap of infrastructure investment. It is a result of many years without investing enough in quality and stock of infrastructure. We all know that Brazil is no newcomer when it comes to private participation infrastructure. Brazil certainly, if you look from 1995 to now, certainly is one of the countries that have done the largest program of private participation infrastructure. On any measure that you want to use, if you look at the investments in the infrastructures or the revenues that the government got from these contracts, you'll see that Brazil, the only countries that have programs of private participation infrastructure that are comparable to the Brazilian are maybe India and China. But even then, you can see that our program is very diversified, very comprehensive in terms of sectors. We have done private participation infrastructure from telecommunications to hospitals, in all sectors between these very different things. So what I want to really tell you today, all these things everybody, I assume that everybody knows, is that we have really deviate in the last 10 years from best practice on private participation infrastructure in Brazil. And we really need to come back to the cornerstones now of best practice on that. The current government is trying to do that. I think that it's in the right way, but very shy in terms of adopting the measures and the reforms that need to be done. Let me give you 2 or 3 examples depending on my time. Regulatory agents. You know that anywhere in the world, commissioners of regulatory agents are appointed for a fixed term, and they are previously approved by the legislative branch. So they are appointed by the administration, approved by the legislative branch, and they have a fixed term. This is to guarantee the independence, the political independence of the regulatory agents. In Brazil, since 2012, many times, especially in the federal government, commissioners were appointed without any confirmation by the legislative branch, and without a fixed term, so they could be fired at any point by the president. I remember that in 2013, I wrote an article about that. The main regulatory agents, the transport federal regulatory agents, I'm saying that it's the main one because most of the investments that the government wanted to do was in those sectors, in the sectors that were regulated by these agents. These agents had 4 commissioners that could be fired at any point, and just 1 commissioner that could not be fired, that had a fixed term. So this is not really an independent regulatory agency. You can't trust that it will take independent decisions. What have the new government done about it? The new government, Temer's government, is appointing the commissioner using the regular process. So the commissioners appointed by this government went through the procedure, the regular procedure, were approved by the legislative branch, and they have a fixed term. But the government haven't done anything to guarantee that in the future, another government, the next administration, will not again appoint commissioners without a fixed term and without the confirmation of the legislative branch. So this is a reform, institutional reform that we need to do. And you saw Renato Mazzola saying that concession contracts have to have arbitration clauses. Why is that? Especially because we don't trust that the regulatory agents will be able to take independent decisions. Some years ago, when the regulatory agents were working well, nobody would speak about arbitration clauses in these contracts because the regulatory agents would take the independent decisions. We didn't need a panel of arbitrators to do that. So we really need to reform the regulatory agents. Another example, in this government is not taking this step, maybe because it's very concerned with the social security reform at this point. Maybe it's because of that. But the bottom line is that the reform is not being done, okay? We need this to be done in order to have a program of investment in infrastructure in the near future. Another example is the fiscal problems. Since this government is so committed to fiscal policy, there are some things that should be done in the institutional framework for private participation in infrastructure. As you may know, the former governments were able to circumvent the fiscal controls by subsidizing financing of the project. Let me explain this. I know that it's not so obvious. If you have a project that is not financially self-sustainable with charging tariffs, I mean a project that needs the concessionaire, you need to charge tariffs from the users and also receive government payment. If you have a project with this kind of profile, you can, do it foreseeing the government paid, explicit government payments for the services. In this, if you look at the Brazilian statutes on PPPs, you need to have fiscal analysis of that. You have to look if it's compatible with the capacity of the country of generate revenues for the government. So there is a lot of analysis that you have to do before the government commits to pay to a concessionaire for a PPP. It's long-term commitment, so it's really important that you have the fiscal controls on that. So how the former government circumvented these fiscal controls? They just, the payment of the government was concealed in the subsidized financing. Today, we don't know how much the government committed at the end with these projects. Let me give you an example. The 6 roads that were bid in 2013 and 2014 by Dilma's government. All the payment from the government to the concessionaire is done through the subsidized financing. So we don't have any account of how much the government is actually committing with this. So as the current government, Temer's government, is very committed with the fiscal issues, I think we should have some reform in our regulations on fiscal controls to make these things transparent, to allow, to forbid the next administrations to conceal government commitments, payment commitments under subsidized financing. I have no problem with subsidized financing, okay? In some cases, it makes sense to do the subsidy through financing. But you have to account for it. You have to know what is the size of the commitment. So this is a second example. Do I have time for a third one? No, I don't have time for a third one. So the third one that I was going to give, and I won't just mention it, is about the poor risk allocation and poor rules on renegotiation of contracts. Many contracts are going through problems right now, and we are having a lot of difficulty to renegotiate this contract. The government issued administrative act, how to say this in English? Medida provisória, I don't know how to, executive act to allow this renegotiation, which doesn't make sense. You have an executive act of the president to allow renegotiation of contract. Doesn't make sense in any way. But it's because the contracts are poorly built. And maybe to your surprise, these airports that were just bid and that Renato mentioned that it was a success. Yes, it was a success. We have the same problem there. The contracts have the same problems, the same poor risk allocation, the same poor rules on renegotiation. And if we face problems in the next years with these projects, probably we have difficulty to renegotiate these projects. So there are only these three examples. I really think that the current government is really shy. There is a lot of reform that should be done, and that's why I think I come to this kind of place and really feel that I should say this and explain this to people. Most people in Brazil are not looking at it in detail. Thank you.
Well, I will have one last question to Mauricio, and then I will open to the audience to make questions. Mauricio, I completely agree with your analysis on the deviation of best practices that happened in the past years in Brazil. In the port sector, the same happened, and the result was that there was almost public port concessions in the past 4 or 5 years because there was no stability. And we know, like, multi-billion-dollar projects, long-term projects needs a really stable framework, right, in order to give safety to the investors. So my question is, in order to make the Brazilian concession model more sound, more business-friendly, more robust, what are the 1 or 2 points that you think it's critical to be addressed?
Very difficult to... Yeah, in 2 minutes, in 2 points.
So just make it one.
It's an impossible mission. There are many things. I think that the most important that I would say it's the one that I mentioned about the regulatory agents. If you don't have agents that are independent from the government, and look, I mentioned to you the problem of the political independence, okay? But there are other problems, because at this point, the last 10 years the government has done many measures to reduce the administrative independence of these agents, the financial independence of these agents. So at the end, they are just a common agents of the government, not an independent regulatory agents. So if you don't have this, how the conflicts will be decided, how the contracts will be managed by someone that is independent. There is no independent agent at this point, and that's why we need arbitration for most of the contracts. You know, for me, as a lawyer, it's really fine to have arbitration, okay? I'm working some of them. My law firm used to be a firm specialized in structuring new concessions. At this point, we are very specialized in renegotiate concessions and go to arbitrations about concession. It's really fine, okay, for me personally. But the cost of arbitration doesn't make sense, especially if you are already having the cost of having regulatory agencies. Because we do have regulatory agents, but they don't work as independent regulatory agents. Okay? Just this.
Thank you. Okay, so I'd like to open for questions to the audience.
Nowadays in Brazil, we have a discussion about performance bonds and how it would affect competition in these in PPPs. And so, what's your opinion on that?
Do you want to address for who?
It can be Mauricio.
Can you repeat the question, please?
Performance bonds.
Oh, okay. I wrote 3 articles already about that, okay? So there are some people in Brazil, after this, all this corruption scandals, okay? We have now scandals, political scandals on corruption in the infrastructure sectors in Brazil on a daily basis, okay? You have to watch the TV every day very, very attentively because it will be a scandal almost every day. So in this environment, people start to think that the bidding procedure rules that we have right now in Brazil are not enough to prevent corruption, okay? And then, you know, some people that don't really know how performance bonds work, some people start to say that we should not ask anymore in the bidding procedure for technical requirements of the bidders. What they say is, by requiring technical certifications of the bidders, the government agents would control the bidding procedure and choose who would participate of this bid, okay? And these people would say, well, let's stop doing that and ask just for a performance bond with the full value of the contract. This doesn't make sense in any way, because if you ask for a performance bond in the full value of the contract, when someone gives a performance bond, the security companies ask for a counter guarantee. And this counter guarantee goes to the balance sheet of the guy that gives the counter guarantee. So the number of players that would be able to get the performance bond with full value is very small. So this idea would favor collusion and not prevent it. But people that is defending them don't really know how performance bonds work, which is a shame, because some of the people that is defending it are known as specialists in infrastructure. No? Not very good specialists, I would say.
Okay. Any other question?
Hi, everyone. I'm Alexandre Lima, one of the ambassadors of Brazil Conference 2016. I study engineer, and I have an interest to work with PPPs, but I do not know how. So what are the options besides a bank?
Who wants to answer that?
Okay. Well, I've been hiring and firing for 10 years now, so let me... Options. Who provides this service? And what is my competition? Basically, the big four, kind of consultancy firms. Investment bankers used to participate in these markets, but they disappear. I think that the length, the duration of the mandate is too much for them. Let me give you a number. IFC has been in this business for more than 20 years internationally. Our average duration from the moment we signed the mandate to the moment that the government signed the PPP contract after a bidding process is on average 18 months. In an 18 months, probably an M&A division in an investment bank could do 4 or 5 transactions. So the opportunity cost for them is too high. So if you want to go into this business, probably it's better to tap into either us, so I can accept resumes after this, or kind of Deloitte, KPMG, PwC. They do participate in this market as advisors.
I would just add one comment. As an engineer, you can also work in one of as a technical consultant, helping to assess traffic risk, technical risk, so anything related to the engineering part of the process.
Okay. On the back over there.
Hi, how are you? My name is Rafael. I'm from Brazil and previously from Harvard Law School. So my question is, which contributions external controls like the auditing courts, like TCU, for instance, are giving to the regulation of concession contracts in Brazil considering our current framework, our current legal framework? Thank you.
Mauricio, can you answer that?
Yeah. You're talking about the watchdogs, right? TCU and the others, right? You guys, after this, I think that I won't be able to be a lawyer again in Brazil because everybody will hate me. But let me tell what. At this point, I think that the way that TCU is working in the infrastructure sector is disturbing the sector. Okay, obvious that it's not only to blame TCU, because you have at this point this environment of untrust, in this environment of as I mentioned, the political scandals all the time. So everybody is sort of having doubts about if the legal framework that we have, institutional framework, really work as it should. So at this point, TCU is many times taking decisions that the regulatory agents should be taking, and also in many times, and I have been a lawyer for some agents in regulatory agents, they are trying to punish civil servants that work in the regulatory agent because they have issued opinions or because they have done anything that does not agree with what TCU thinks that should be done. So it's not a matter, TCU used to do that in the past when there was any kind of proof of corruption or anything like this. But now you have punishment for opinion. If you give an opinion that is different from what TCU, without any suspect of personal benefits, you can get punished. So I think that TCU is another part of the infrastructure sector that has to be reformed, but I won't have the time here to explain what I think should be done in relation to it. In the past, it has done have given many contributions to the sector. At this point, I think it's not anymore.
We have time for 2 more questions. So.
Hi, I'm Marcelo from I'm an MBA student from the Harvard Business School. So I have a question regarding, we talked a lot about concessions. We haven't talked a lot about private investors investing in infrastructure. So what kind of measures or what kind of policies changes do we need to have further actual private projects in Brazil, such as Porto Central in Espírito Santo, Porto do Sul in Brazil, and Rio? So what can we do to make more private players and not only rely on public concessions?
Renato, can you answer that?
I think the basic step, the first and most basic step is to investors, they will need to feel confident that the economy is going to be stable. You are a long-term investor. You're not a short-term investor. When you see the improvements in the economy, it's not a coincidence that you see the first money in going to the stock exchange, because it's money that is easy to get in, easy to get out. Long-term investments normally takes a while. Just the due diligence process takes a while. The investment process, the approvals, the authorizations, the whole process could take easily over 2 years. And when you want to exit, it's the same thing. So you need to have macro stability together with political stability. Second, and this includes not only inflation, interest rate, but also FX, so everything. So second, I think you need to have a stable regulatory framework. As Mauricio was saying, for instance, the pressure and the concerns that we have today with TCU and all the watchdogs with regards to the way they are looking at concessions and even authorizations, it's always a big question mark. So we investors, especially international investors, they will need to feel comfortable with the regulatory framework. And finally, I think it's a matter of risk-return profile. So you're gonna, for international investors, they can put their money to work anywhere in the world. It could be Europe, could be Middle East, could be Latin America, and even if they want to allocate money into one specific economy into Latin America, they would compare different economies. So I think for when you take into consideration the level of yield that you expect to get in this investment compared to the level of yield that you obtain on a government bond, is a first assessment, whether it's better to go to fixed income or the equity market. And then the second step on your analysis is actually to compare this return to whatever you can get elsewhere in the world. So once you go through these 3 steps, you would pick your country, and then it's just a matter of finding the right asset.
Okay, unfortunately, our time is over. I'd like to thank all the speakers and wish a good afternoon to everyone.